Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's 𝘲𝗏𝗏 podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Jeff Zimmerman, who is a faculty member at the Iowa State University College of Veterinary Medicine. How are you today, Jeff?
Very good, Laura. How are you?
Good. Well, we're glad to have you on today. We're going to go ahead and get started. And so what I'd like for you to first do is maybe just help our listeners out there learn a little bit more about yourself. So would you mind just sharing a little bit about how you maybe got to where you're at today and just some general ideas about what your work is focused on?
Sure. So my background was, after vet school, was in epidemiology. I worked initially in the 𝘮𝑗𝘗𝑟𝑎𝑏𝑖𝑎 eradication program that you might recall, some of your elder members at least might recall. From that was basically my PhD work. And then I got hired into the veterinary diagnostic lab here at Iowa State as an epidemiologist, so doing research in animal populations. And that's really been where I've been at ever since. Probably initially, most of my work was with PRRS, trying to characterize PRRS virus transmissibility, infectivity, all kinds of population-based dynamics for PRRS virus. And then about 15 years ago, I started getting really interested in surveillance because it became obvious to me that we could do a lot of work under experimental conditions, but you really needed to be able to collect field data in order to really be able to understand what was going on. You needed bigger populations and more realistic settings to understand the true nature of the virus. But the problem was for surveillance is, if you remember, the pseudorabies eradication program was based on bleeding pigs. And that's an extremely inefficient, expensive, arduous method of collecting population data. So it would have been in 2005, we collected the first oral fluid samples. And the results were so encouraging that that's really been a lot of where my efforts gone ever since then. Not just in PRRS, but in quite a number of other infectious agents of pigs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can remember helping you with some of those samples early on, sending you some. But it's wonderful. It's amazing to me how widely accepted that's been now for the industry. And when I share that with others that are first getting into the industry, they're like, wow, this is really easy and not hard to do. So it's wonderful technology to have for the industry. So we thank you for all of that work.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot left to be done yet, though. So.
Oh, yes, always. Well, one of the things that I know you're also very active in is what we call the US S.H.I.P program. And some of our audience may not be very familiar with that program. So could you maybe start with just a background as to what that program is and what it's currently doing?
Sure. The Swine Health Improvement Plan, the S.H.I.P plan, or S.H.I.P program, really started probably almost 4 years ago. It was primarily the brainchild of Dr. Roger Main, who began even presenting it at NPIP. Got some funding and began running some analyses, some comparisons, especially with the NPIP program. The NPIP stands for National Poultry Improvement Plan. And so there were a lot of similarities. We're both looking at population medicine, health in populations, whether it's poultry and pigs. And so there were a lot of things that we could learn from NPIP that could apply to S.H.I.P. And so the S.H.I.P is our effort to apply some of those lessons from NPIP to swine health. It's basically the program we're still working on. We're a year into what's a pilot project that's been funded by USDA. We had our first House of Delegates meeting in Des Moines, August 21st and 22nd. And we're kind of taking our first initial steps at organization. So if you look at the history of NPIP, the National Poultry Improvement Plan, they began about 1935. So they have 85 years of experience in the control of issues, health issues related to poultry. And so S.H.I.P is beginning to address those issues as well. Our S.H.I.P basically has three initiatives. One is is surveillance, or is better said, sampling and testing. One is biosecurity, and one is traceback. And if we have those arms in place, it puts us in a better position to deal with foreign animal diseases if they were to show up in the U.S. And of course, African swine fever is a particular concern, but classical swine fever, which we eliminated from the U.S. in 1978, is also a concern because it's still in populations that are close to us, close to our borders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something we tend to forget. We've been talking about ASF so much lately, but CSF is equally as concerning. So for those of the audience that may not really be familiar with the NPIP, what does that mean from a producer standpoint? Are they looking to buy in? Is it like a checkoff to support? Do they submit samples? What kind of look does that have for our swine industry producer?
Yeah, for the swine industry producer, there's probably going to be some, well, first of all, I'd say that S.H.I.P is driven by the involvement of producers, packers, USDA, and academicians. The House of Delegates meeting, like I just mentioned, we had that first meeting in August of this year, and that included all those representatives of the USDA, of producers, packers, and academicians. And so it's a way to come together, address specific health problems. The most pressing, of course, right now for us is African swine fever, and then reach some kind of mutual decision. And so it relies on the collaboration of that group, and it's not charging specific fees or anything, but it does, if you're going to be certified in S.H.I.P, there will be certain requirements that you need to maintain.
Okay, very good. So we're talking about each site being certified in S.H.I.P as a sellable product. Is that what we're looking at? Much like PQA certification or something along those lines?
Something along those lines. Yeah. PQA would be a good analogy. There's no requirement. You're not required to be a S.H.I.P participant, but certification brings benefits.
Okay, perfect. And so something else I heard in that conversation was traceability. And so we would anticipate then, if you're going to be a producer certified in the S.H.I.P program, you will have some form of traceability to your animals, to the packer. Would that be fair?
Yes, that's fair. Yeah, there's got to be some mechanism by which you can track what has been the movement of your particular animals, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then as far as surveillance goes, is that, again, just their general submissions? Are there going to be monthly submission requirements, or are you just sampling, blood samples from market hogs as they're coming in, and that's part of surveillance? What does that really look like with the S.H.I.P program?
It's with the S.H.I.P program, it looks a little bit different. And the rules have not been put in place. Part of what's happened in the August meeting was the agreement that we would move forward with a group to study how that might happen. What S.H.I.P has proposed is a very minimal sampling numbers, and by that I mean in peacetime, or say in the absence of African swine fever, classical swine fever, collect samples from 5 animals, and those samples would be very simple samples, oral swabs. Or it could be blood swabs like people collect a lot, or it could be an oral fluid sample like people collect a lot. Put those in one tube, so we're looking at a pooled sample, and send them in. It turns out that even though we're actually using very minimal sampling numbers, then when you put those all together at a regional basis, the likelihood of detection, the probability of detecting, in this case, African swine fever or classical swine fever, is extremely high. And so it's the power of putting all those numbers together that really gets us a good benefit. And it actually reduces any kind of imposition or cost to producers.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I remember too is that we were doing surveillance a lot with tonsils, for example, for CSF. And so anytime we submit samples for diagnostic evaluation, we try to grab the tonsils to help with that type of surveillance. So is 𝘮𝑲P going to be using diagnostic labs in the general surveillance samples that they're getting as part of your program, or is that going to be still separate? And so just producers that are involved in the 𝘮𝑲P certification will be sending in those samples?
Yeah. At this point in time, those two lines of samples have not been merged.
Okay.
But of course, as I mentioned, USDA is part of 𝘮𝑲P, so that could be a possibility in the future. At the present time, the 𝘮𝑲P sampling is under study, and the got tonsil program is still in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. I think that certainly will help some of our veterinarians in particular start thinking about sampling and so forth. Will there be any other expectations as far as a certification goes that you're aware of currently for our farmers?
No, it's basically if you have to have a PIN number and you need to sign up for the program, but the requirements beyond that are minimal. Mm-hmm. If I could say just a little bit more about sampling, because surveillance sampling has been kind of arduous for a lot of us for a long time. If you actually go back far enough, in the classical swine fever eradication program in the U.S., the plan was to test every pig in a herd, if you can imagine. So they would test every pig, and that was how you figured out if you had classical swine fever or not. And then in 1986 in Peoria, it's a date I remember because there was this meeting of all these movers and shakers in veterinary medicine at this meeting to decide how they're going to sample for pseudorabies eradication. And there were the people who wanted to continue sampling every pig in the herd, if you can imagine. And then there's kind of the new wave that wanted to go with representative sampling. And that's when we started talking about sampling 30 pigs. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until the mid 80s that we started thinking about sampling some of the pigs and not all the pigs. And so we're kind of looking at the next iteration. And by that I mean 30 is more than we need for 𝘮𝑲P if we add all these results together. So if all the farms in the county or all the farms in some region aggregate their testing results, each person has to do less, but the results are actually much more sensitive than collecting 30 per farm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. Not that long ago, we were having this discussion about how many samples to use and what right. appropriate pooling sizes were. And particularly, yeah. I think it's important to keep reiterating because as we've talked about in the past, the technology has changed, the sensitivity has changed. Yeah. We've certainly have done a better job of refining our technique. And so yeah. those numbers should, in a sense, be dwindling from the every pig to right. 5 in a region and right. give us that feel. I think, though, it still raises a little bit of concern when we start talking particularly about a foreign animal disease and the thought of sampling 5 pigs in a region versus multiple pigs within a barn. So is there any way that we can maybe address that issue? Because I think that, particularly with ASF and the fact that it moves fairly quietly for a while in a barn has a lot of people very concerned about surveillance. Yeah.
Well, Dr. 𝘮𝑲𝗎 and her group at Minnesota are actually looking at, they're creating estimates of the probability of detecting if you target samples in a barn. So what's the probability of detecting African swine fever if you just sample some of those not doing well pigs in the barn? And so they're developing those estimates over time. And so we're taking that to the next level and say, okay, beyond the barn, how about in the county? If I get all those samples from those sick pigs in those barns, what's my likelihood of detecting in the county or the region, whatever that region might be? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes pretty powerful. I'd separate out what 𝘮𝑲P is trying to do also from USDA controlled efforts. So if I can get those samples, I can guarantee you, or I can give you a strong assurance, maybe not guarantee, but I can give you strong assurance that the region is negative for African swine fever, classical swine fever, whatever we want to look for. Once there's a positive, we say a non-negative because the VDLs, the non-labs like Iowa State or Minnesota or South Dakota, we can't call the sample positive for classical swine fever or African swine fever, but we can say it's non-negative. Then it goes to USDA, and USDA starts their investigation. So their investigation is separate from what 𝘮𝘃 is doing. 𝘮𝘃 is saying the region's negative. If any of the 𝘮𝘃 labs say, I got a non-negative sample, then that goes to USDA, and USDA takes over, and hopefully we're early in the game and their efforts are highly effective. But again, if the 𝘮𝘃 traceback and biosecurity is in place, as well as sampling and testing, we have a much stronger assurance that we're going to come on this early and be successful in eliminating a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something I continue to hear in the industry is, should we just be sampling all the blood that's coming into the market facilities, because that might give us a good clue. And when we think back to the PED era and we look back at some of the plasma, it started to let us know when it actually came into the US versus maybe when we were truly seeing it in the industry in terms of clinical symptoms. So I think that's important to really continue to discuss that surveillance and, how often and how frequently are we checking various parts of the country? Because I think, again, we argue, well, if you're in Iowa or North Carolina where there's pig heavy areas, then we're doing a lot more surveillance there just by sheer number versus maybe other parts of the United States. And I think that's concerning to people, is that, well, what if it sneaks in these areas that maybe aren't being sampled as frequently just because of numbers of pigs in a location? Is there any way that we can maybe talk about how we should do surveillance when we think about just pig population density?
So we've been looking at some models that address that issue. What happens if African swine fever shows up in a pig dense area as opposed to a less dense area? And we're not finished, but the preliminary analyses make it look like it doesn't really matter too much where the virus shows up, because eventually that producer he's going to have some kind of interaction with another producer or with the packing plant. And so from our models, it looks like you've got a period of about 35 days when it's going to smolder. After 35 days is when things really start taking off. And so that's why for us, a few samples from lots of herds is pretty sensitive. If we can find that smoldering hotspot and stomp it out before it gets any further, that's going to be the key. Mm-hmm. In terms of sampling and slaughter, we actually have really effective methods for sampling and slaughter. Oral fluids work pretty well. Pigs in lairage are perfectly happy to chew on a rope. We can get oral fluids from them pretty well. And I can't speak for the packing industry or for packers, but I know that I would prefer to have African swine fever detected before it gets to my plant, because if it gets to my plant, I've got to shut it down, decontaminate. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be complex and it's going to be costly. So if we as an industry can detect our problems before they get to the packing plant, we're going to be much better off. We don't want packing plants to close. That's going to create big problems for us. There are places that are talking about collecting samples at slaughter. Latin America, I've talked to some people in Latin America, and for them, it makes much more sense because they have lots of small packing plants and lots of small producers that they could detect that way. But for us, I think it's probably not a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. How often, and maybe I missed this from our earlier conversation, but how often would you sample a region?
So what we proposed and what went through the first House of Delegates meeting was sampling once a year in peacetime. So in the absence of African swine fever, classical swine fever, once a year is sufficient, because just make sure that people remember how to collect the sample, they've got the supplies on hand. They're just testing the system. It's basically kind of like turning your car on when it's cold outside, let it warm up. So the car's already warmed up. Once something happens, then we're proposing depends somewhat on what kind of production system you have. So for breeding herds, for example, we're going to ask for well, I should go back. Let me go back a little bit. So the SHIP program is based on 3 risk levels. Risk level 1 is no African swine fever, no classical swine fever in the US. Risk level 2 is it's someplace in the US, but it's not in my state or my region. And risk level 3, it's in my state or region, but I'm not in a control area. So USD is not involved. The sampling numbers are about the same for those different, but it's sampling frequency that changes. So level 1, there's no African swine fever, no classical swine fever in the US. Sample once a year, just to make sure that everything is in place. Once I get to level 2, so African swine fever, classical swine fever is in the US, but not in my state, then things go up a little bit, sampling once a month. And then level 3, it's in my state. Depending on the kind of operation, I may be sampling every 2 weeks. My numbers go up slightly, not very much, sampling numbers go up slightly. But the frequency is what really is affected once every 2 weeks in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what would be intriguing is that frequency, particularly right now, people are very nervous, as we would expect with where ASF is located. And so I can hear in my own mind some people arguing, well, once a year in a region may not be enough, but it's really more, well, this producer is taking a sample in this region once a year. This producer might be taking that sample next month in this region for their once a year. So it's not really this county is getting measured once a year type of situation. Is that a fair thought process?
That's fair. And that's going to be, remember, SHIP is organized at the state level. So how they expect their participants to fulfill their responsibility is going to be up to them. Hopefully not everybody submits their samples on December 31st. Right. We're hoping that people spread it out over the course of the year, but it's going to be up to the state level organizations to help that happen. It could be like your driver's license. My driver's license is due on my birthday, my birthday month. So something more reasonable like that spreads things out would be good.
Could be by premise ID, certification, and so forth.
Right.
What can our veterinarians do to help with this program?
My experience is the biggest thing we need help on is simply getting the word out. Why are we doing this? What is the need? How does it work? What's going to be the impact? I think it's easy to justify the need, but that education component is difficult. It takes time. People are busy, and they don't necessarily want to be informed about things that don't immediately impact them.
Mm-hmm. I can almost envision it where a producer signs up for the program, but then it lays on the veterinarian during one of their annual herd visits to be the person to remember to send those samples in. Right. And maybe I'm wrong in that, but again, while it's oral fluids and it might be very easy to do, you're absolutely right. It just with the veterinarian being there and they naturally are collecting samples, I somewhat can see that becoming part of their responsibility. Yeah. And for your listeners, there's a SHIP website. So if they just Google US SHIP, they'll find probably more information and they want to look at it one sitting. So now that would be wonderful. And I think that would be a great place for both the veterinarians and the producers to start to figure out what's next and what's coming for them. But that's really exciting. And it's great to hear that we have some very active surveillance programs going on in the United States beyond just people obviously in the barn looking for signs. Right. I think the good thing, and it was not me, but the people who started leading this project started a couple of years ago. So now, as African swine fever gets closer, we have something in place that could really be highly useful, could save us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, as we kind of finish up our conversation today, are there any key takeaway points that you would like our audience to remember from today, or anything that we've missed that you would like to cover? I would just, again, remind them, go ahead and look at that website just to see what US SHIP is about.
This is not a government program. This is a producer-driven program, participant-driven program, veterinary-driven program. So it's going to rely on those of us who are in the industry to make it move forward. It's not a government program coming out of Washington, D.C. It's coming out of people who are invested in swine production.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good point. It's an opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive from both the producer and the veterinarian standpoint, which is always a good place to be.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up our time today, Dr. Zimmerman, we like to ask our speakers a couple of questions that are very common across all of our podcasts. The first one we like to ask you is, obviously being involved in swine, what is your best go-to swine resource book or website or whatever you're currently using?
Well, of course, Diseases of Swine is the definitive text. And so that's what it's right, got it right up here on the shelf. And so that's what I go to. But I also use, I use a lot of primary refereed publications. So I'm using Google Scholar a lot to find things, and then I track things from there. I'm always looking for the most recent information on whatever topic it is that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point. I don't think I've met a vet yet whose favorite book is not The Diseases of Swine. and I'll admit we have a couple of copies in our house as well. So it's a great resource. But I agree, while we continue to have new versions of it coming out, using those refereed websites to find the most recent information is going to be critical. So That's a very, very good point. The other question we like to ask is, when you're not thinking about pigs, is there anything that you like to read on the side that you would recommend to our audience, whether it's for enjoyment or for professional development or anything like that?
So I have a horrible confession to make, which is I read all day long. Unlike some people, I'm not out in the truck, looking at stuff. So I spend a lot of time reading and writing. And when I go home, I like to be outside. We have a small place. We got 10 acres, and so I like to plant trees and work on trees and be outside. So That's probably my favorite pastime.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. I know. Certainly, when you're writing a manuscript, the last thing you want to do is read at night.
Yeah, go home and read somewhere.
Yeah. You do. You need to be outside at that point for sure. Especially right now, the weather is just beautiful.
Yes, it's just gorgeous out my window.
Yes, yes. Well, the last question I like to ask our speaker really comes back to, if you think about people in the industry that you define as successful, and success can vary in everybody's mind as to how you want to define it. But what characteristic stands out in your mind when you think about the people that you have looked up to over the years, or that you feel are very successful today?
For me, so I work with graduate students a lot, so there's really two things that I like to help them develop. And I think one thing is communication skills, whether it's written or oral. We have different strengths, but to try to improve your oral communication skills and your written communication skills is critical. You need to be able to present your ideas on paper or orally in a logical fashion that makes sense to people, is persuasive. If you can't do that, it really is a huge handicap. So that's probably the number one thing. The second thing is to develop analytical or statistical skills. And those, again, I try to encourage in my graduate students. I'm not particularly strong in statistics myself, but I like to work with people. So we have excellent statisticians on our team we work with all the time. And you can't know everything, but at least to know what you don't know, and then look for those analytical people that can help you is huge.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, those are two great characteristics to be thinking about, and certainly communication, whether it's the one-on-ones or in large settings, it's invaluable for sure. Well, we do want to thank you again for spending time with us today. For our audience, again, this is Dr. Jeff Zimmerman, who's with the Iowa State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. So thank you again for your time and your wonderful insight on the SHIP program.
Thank you, Dr. Greiner.
Have
Be
a
in
great
touch.
day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.